I'm so happy to be joined now by some of our partners from the United Nations who are committed to sharing the vision of making the United Nations more accessible, but also inspiring action for the Sustainable Development Goals. Mr. Rob Skinner is the Executive Director of the United Nations Office for Partnerships, and Mr. Maher Nasser is the Director for Outreach Division for the United Nations Department of Public Information. Rob, the United Nations is committed to making itself accessible to people around the world. Tell us a bit more about what your office does and how you do that.
Great. Thank you, Hazami, for hosting us today and for putting on the Global People Summit. It's great to be here. We're really pleased that you're making, those of us from the United Nations more accessible, to the peoples of the world as we get ready for the big week at the UN, the high-level week of the UN General Assembly. One of the ways that the UN Office for Partnerships is working to make the UN more accessible, and first of all, I just wanted to emphasize our name. We're the UN Office for Partnerships, and so what that means to me is opening up the space around the UN for partners to join us and be part of the conversation, just much like what you're doing here with the summit. So what we're doing is making sure that people have access to the space, when it's appropriate. We're bringing different kinds of varied groups into the UN, whether it's investors, business people, civil society, working with Maher and his team at the Department of Public Information to bring the NGO community in. We just want to make sure that we're as accessible as we can be, because we know if we're going to succeed on the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, we need everyone. We need all voices in. If we're going to leave no one behind, we need to make sure all voices are heard. Leave no voices behind.
Great, and a big part of that is getting people to understand the agenda. And I think, Maher, I heard you speak recently at the UN, and you said that the people at the United Nations in the development space speak UNese. I believe that's how you phrased it. UNLEs or UNEs, one of the other. But you work a lot with creative engagement, and you guys work to, in essence, take this UNEs language and the programming and the very important political and policy discussions that come out of the UN and package them in a way that people can actually start to engage with them. Can you tell us a bit more about your vision and your strategy of making both the UN and the SDGs more accessible? What does that look like?
It's not an easy challenge. I mean, the UN is a very complex organization, and so are, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, the interlinkages between them, the 169 targets. But what we try to do is try to look at how certain things have changed in the human behavior. Look at when I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, pop culture glorified smoking. Everybody smoked in film and television, but Hollywood Health and Society, working with the creative community, managed to basically make smoking uncool. So you don't see today what is produced is smoking being glorified. And that has led to major reductions in people smoking, and of course, higher awareness about the danger of smoking, and it was all soft messaging and done in a very creative and simple way. What we try to do is work with creatives so that also messages of what the SDGs are about are incorporated within the storyline. We started an initiative last week. 2 weeks ago, we launched actually collaboration with our youngest audience, with Thomas the Tank Engine children's animated series with Mattel, that 9 of the new 26 series have 6 of the SDGs incorporated within the storyline, not obviously saying that these are SDGs, but basically trying to bring in gender equality to a show that only showed male trains. Now there are equal male and female trains. There's diversity, there are references to environment, protection of animals, so there are different ways of reaching out. Because for me, yes, I said the UN is very complex, but the UN also is based on the Charter of the United Nations, which says we the peoples. And we the peoples is everybody listening to this global summit, everybody who comes to the UN, and governments are, of course, who constitute the United Nations. So making your voice heard isn't just directly coming to New York, but also you can make your voice heard through your government. I think what is important is people's engagement within their communities, within their governments as well, at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level. If a government is going to move in one direction, it has to be a direction that is endorsed and supported by the people. Now, the global agenda is the people's agenda. When people say the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, I correct them. I say these are not United Nations. They are your goals. They are our goals. And yes, if you read a UN report, it reads very dry, and it reads, like I said, it is UNEs. And we try to simplify it, but creative people help us simplify it. The icons for the SDGs were created and developed by an artist, and was a collaboration between us and Project Everyone, led by Richard Curtis. So that's the kind of collaboration that bring the great ideas that the UN has brought to the wider public through non-UNese language.
Non-UNese language. So your office, Rob, also does a lot of that non-UNese type stuff, including, for example, supporting and working with people like us that come to you with ideas that aim to connect with people. I think a lot of people think about the United Nations as not wanting to engage with people, and presumably the office, your office, and others at the UN have an intention to become more inclusive. What does an inclusive United Nations look like to you, and how can people that are watching that are unsure of how they can start to really get involved with the UN, what does that look like for people?
Right. I mean, we just really want to dispel that notion that we don't want the voices to be heard. We absolutely do want the voices to be heard, and I think that, you know, Azami, we've known each other for a long time, and I see that one of your partners here is the UN Foundation, which of course, you know, I was my employer for several years, and one of the reasons back in, I think it's 8 years ago now, we started the Social Good Summit, was to bring in those voices, which is still going. It's on Sunday. Small plug for them. Apologies.
We will be there.
I know you will. But and that's what we're talking about, making sure that, you know, the people that speak the UNese language, ourselves and our colleagues, are out there talking to people and working with people, whether it's inside the UN or outside the UN at events like this and activities like this, saying, okay, how can we do better? What do we need to do to deliver on the goals? And the first thing we need to do is translate and make sure everyone understands the goals. You know, and Maher referenced some of our partners. You know, we're working closely with Richard Curtis to, as we go forward in 2019 and 2020, 2 critical years on the goals as governments come back and really do significant reporting on the goals. 2020, we're 10 years out, we're 5 years in, and it's amazing to me that we're 3 years since the goals were adopted, and we need to do more, and we need to drive that message through, and we need to be talking to people and working with people everywhere in the world. And again, as Maher said, it's not about necessarily being at the UN, which is the beauty of this event. It's taking what's happening at the UN, talking to people about it, and getting it out there in the communities. You know, the Sustainable Development Goals are not going to be reached inside that building on First Avenue. They're going to be reached in communities at the local level by people that care. And the governments need civil society, they need business, the private sector, they need academia, and they need people to drive the achievement of the goals, you know, for the people. This is all about delivering for the people, lifting people out of poverty, saving the planet, reaching gender equality, and that's just the betterment of the planet. And so, as I said in my first answer, all voices, we need them all.
So it's interesting because I think a lot of times when we talk to people about the global goals or about any of the language that's coming out of the UN, and I used to work for the UN Envoy on Youth, and one of the biggest challenges that we kept coming across is people said, you know, I just don't understand and do not agree with anything my government is doing or the United Nations is doing. But oftentimes it was they didn't have the opportunity to actually understand. One of the things that we're really passionate about with the Global People Summit is creating that convening space to allow people to really bring down their barriers in a way and actually start to listen and understand what is the perspective that a government brings, what is the perspective that a civil society brings, what is this perspective that a business or a foundation brings. Because in some way, I mean, even when you look at the metrics around the SDGs, no one agrees on, you know, whether it's businesses and how they measure their impact or whether it's governments and how they measure their impact. So we don't even have a uniform language. We don't have uniform vision, and we all have our different perceived needs. So Maher, in thinking about how do you make the SDGs more accessible to people, how do you really deliver the message that the SDGs are about everybody? If I may not think that healthcare impacts my life, but it does. What is your take on that?
If you just look at the SDGs and read what they are about every person. No matter what is your interest, what is your passion, there's something in the SDGs for you. The Sustainable Development Goals, let's not use acronyms. We're falling into UNEs. But I think it's important to also take the point, governments are, of course, and world leaders adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, the global goals, as some people call them. But it's not just governments that can do it. And as Rob said earlier, governments alone will not be able to achieve the agenda, ending poverty, eradicating hunger, achieving gender equality, access to health, access to education, and all of the other goals. It is important to understand that not only individuals can do and have a role in how they consume, how they act, but it's businesses as well. And businesses do listen to people because businesses want to be, at the moment, they know that actually being perceived as doing good is good for business. Mm-hmm. So people can also now make their voices heard. Social media and technology today is giving voice to the voiceless. Everybody can have a say.
Great.
in a way that influences brands. And I think when you look at who is the major producer of energy, who is major extraction, it's companies. And those companies, once they feel that the people want them to use renewable energy, for example, it has a great impact on climate change. So step by step, governments, individuals, civil society, private sector, we all have to work together to achieve the goals.
Great. And unfortunately,
if I could just add to that.
Yeah,
question.
absolutely.
And we're finding in our office, the Office for Partnerships, great interest from business in aligning themselves with the goals. We've held several events at the UN where we've brought together business investors, particularly saying, we know that people want us to be concerned about poverty, the planet, gender equality, the oceans, all these issues that are part of the goals. Business is saying we recognize it, we want to do well by doing good, and how can we align ourselves and do that translation between the Sustainable Development Goals and what we describe as ESG, in environment, social, and governance investing, to bring those worlds together. It's really happening, and I've been really encouraged by what I've seen with some of these large investors in the last couple of weeks.
Great. Well, I mean, you guys there, you have it. You have an invitation from both Maher and Rob to get involved in the United Nations, to take action, and to learn about the SDGs, because I will use UNEs, since that is the hashtag that most people tend to use. So look it up, the Sustainable Development Goals, and shortly we'll hear from somebody who's going to talk us through the global goals, actually Project Everyone, to teach us about the goals. So thank you so much for all your work, and we look forward to continued engagement with you both. Thank you.
Thank you.